The birds chirp in the background. I have a lot of fun things I want to talk about today. A couple days ago, I asked you what your biggest challenge has been in your garden as of late, and why you garden. And I'll start there. I'm going to be kind of looking down here. I'm looking at my computer, looking at your responses. And first, I just wanted to thank everyone for responding. I have about 50 responses so far in the last 24 hours or so. And looking at your why, your reasons why you're gardening. Thank you for telling me all of that. It's always a nice reminder for me why people are growing food, and turns out it is all the same reasons that I'm growing food. So what I'm going to do now is go through some of your questions that you asked, some of the challenges you're going through, where I think I can give an answer here that would be applicable to many people. In terms of the more specific questions, I'll just answer them in the comments individually. But I thought it would just be kind of neat to talk through some of these things. Also, thank you to those of you who are offering suggestions to other people in the comments. And I'll ask all of you now, if you read through the comments and you've experienced some of these challenges before and you think you have something to offer, by all means, help people out. That's kind of how the Academy works more, is that we have this forum where people ask questions, and certainly I give my responses, but sometimes we get other people helping each other out, and we really can develop more of a community in there, which is a beautiful thing. So it's kind of like the Academy in a sense today. So overall, looking at your main challenges, no surprise that the big one is insects. It always is. Various types of insects in your garden, and diseases as well. A lot of people this time talking about weeds, various weeds becoming a challenge, and you see them this time of year as the snow melts. Sometimes there are some weed issues that came up over winter. A few people talked about weather issues, especially too much heat. Maybe it was a hot year in certain parts of North America, especially this last year. I know I have people from all over the world, but 80-something% of people are in North America. A few animal problems, and a few problems with plants just not doing as well as you liked. And then dealing with soil issues. Just sometimes soil is pretty hard to work with, especially clay soil. So those are the trends in the comments, and I'm just going to go through some of them and talk about some of them. So a couple of people were talking about tomatoes. For different reasons, they thought the crop might have failed. Someone says there was a lot of rain and cool weather, and yes, that certainly can be a problem with tomatoes. I know I lived in the Pacific Northwest for a few years and had a lot of trouble growing tomatoes because even though the growing season is much longer there, we never get the temperatures that the tomatoes need to grow. So if you have a cool year, that can be really hard on tomatoes. If you have too much rain, that can be hard on tomatoes because tomatoes, they need watering regularly, but they need that little bit of stress to become sweet and tasty. So that's often a hard balance with tomatoes, is just getting the right amount of water in there. Someone mentioned mealybugs, and a few people had mentioned some soft-bodied insects like that, mealybugs, and I'm forgetting the other ones right now, but I'll give you some controls for those. Squash bugs, that was another big one, and squash vine borers and stink bugs. So here I actually have a list of things I want to chat about here that I'm going to kind of read through when it comes to dealing with many types of insects. So first of all, crop rotation is usually a good idea. Just every time putting your plant families in different parts of your garden. So that means if you have tomatoes in this spot one year, move them to a different spot next year, and also don't put your potatoes there because that's the same plant family. So maybe you put some herbs there or some squash there. We try to rotate plant families, put them in a different part of the garden at least every 3 years. So not even every other year. We want to have at least 3 years when it gets back to the same spot. Floating row covers can sometimes be useful as long as, so what it does is it protects your plants during certain times of year from insects coming and eating on them. Only time you don't want to do that is when the insects are coming up from the soil, if they overwinter in the soil. So you kind of have to know a little bit about the insect. In that case, you're just giving them protection if you put a floating row cover there. Another interesting one is timing. If you can stagger your plantings of things over the course of a couple of months, sometimes there'll just be a certain planting that does well because you get around the worst time for a certain insect. And so when it comes to like squash bugs, Sometimes you can get a hoop house, like or a cold frame or something that warms up the soil, plant them really early. Sometimes that will get them big enough before a squash bug comes in there. And this can apply to other types of insects and other types of plants as well. And sometimes you can actually plant them pretty late after the insect has been a problem. So I always recommend, if you're having issues, to try to stagger your plantings over a couple of months. Another one someone else mentioned, thank you whoever mentioned that, is diatomaceous earth, which is something you do want to use carefully because it also hurts beneficials. But sometimes you have to experiment with these things and just try a little bit, see what happens. You don't want to be blanketing your whole garden in DE, diatomaceous earth, because again, it can hurt some beneficials. Hand picking, I know it sounds kind of like manual labor, and it is, but sometimes it works really well just to go out there, pick the insects off in the morning or in the evening, or spray them off with the hose. That works with the mealybugs that were mentioned earlier. Spraying them off with the hose can work really well. And then getting into, there are all kinds of products you can use. Sometimes you can just get some dish soap and mix it in water and spray that on your plants. But again, anytime we're using something like that, we're often harming the beneficials. So often you just want to test it on one plant, see if it works. You don't just want to go blanketing your whole garden in dishwasher soap. Same goes for insecticidal soap and horticultural oils, and even neem oil, which I really love. And neem oil actually seems to be like almost like a fertilizer to some plants. And it's not, and it's actually the only pesticide I sell because it seems to not be too harmful to insects, to beneficial insects. But most of these things you want to be careful about spraying all over the place. A trap crop can be a good idea. So when it comes to to squash bugs, sunflowers can work well as a trap crop. So you just surround your squash with sunflowers, and the squash bugs will go to the sunflowers instead of to the squash. And it turns out the sunflowers will also attract ladybugs and other predators that are going to feed on certain types of insects. So oftentimes in a garden, one of my biggest tips is just planting a diversity of plants, especially herbs or herbs. Depends how you say it. Depends on where you live, how you say that. I say herbs. Just plant, like, if you can plant 20 different varieties of herbs throughout your garden liberally, they're going to attract in predatory wasps and all kind of beneficial insects that will feed on aphids and maybe squash bugs, certainly mealybugs, and a lot of these soft-bodied insects. So planting herbs all throughout your garden, that's like probably my number 2 for dealing with insects. My number 1 is going to be having a healthy garden. I talk about this all the time, but if your plants are optimally healthy, then you aren't going to have the insect problems, and it can take 5 years to get to that point. But if you are focusing on bringing in good nutrition into your soil and directly onto your plants, bringing in beneficial microorganisms, bringing in beneficial insects with these herbs, watering properly, having proper sun, and all the kind of stuff I talk about all on this website and especially in my academy, then that's the long-term goal for getting rid of these things. Scrolling down, see if I can find some other good questions here. Oh, so I just wanted to mention, a few people had mentioned weeds, and especially some pretty difficult to control weeds like Johnson grass. So first of all, if you're in a garden, you should just mulch the heck out of your garden. Like, if you can see down here, I just always have, in the fall, I put a thick layer of leaves on my garden, and it stays there usually at least until the summer and sometimes longer. You can also see beneath my apple tree here, can you see the daffodils just poking through? That's just an aside. But yeah, a big mulch can do wonders in a garden, like a 6-inch thick mulch. Of course, then you can't sow seeds into that, so there's always this give or take with mulch. And of course, slugs love mulch, so if you live in a moist climate, then sometimes you have to actually remove the mulch in the spring for a while to let everything dry out. So that is one of the challenges of mulch, but it can do a lot in a garden for controlling weeds. Now, someone had mentioned Johnson grass. Many weeds, all weeds, do well in certain environments. So Johnson grass, as an example, does well in soils that are really compacted, low in organic matter, low in calcium. So long term, if you bring in some organic matter and bring in some calcium, that can help. And usually I would say if you till these things in, that's also going to relieve your compaction, and it's usually good to till these things in, but something with like Johnson grass or any kind of weed that spreads by rhizomes, you don't usually want to be tilling because then you're just spreading it all around. Another big one for weeds is a cover crop in a garden, because if you get like a fast-growing crop like a grass, grasses are usually faster growing than legumes. They build a lot of roots, and they can really help control a cover crop. If you do that every fall and then cut it down in the spring and turn it in the spring, over a few years you can. That's what farmers often do for getting rid of these perennial grasses. So I'm kind of flying through these things today. I just want to give you an example of some ways we deal with things organically rather than just spraying things on them. Someone had mentioned ants, and ants are interesting because there's all kinds of ways to get rid of ants, but if you have a big garden, that usually just means the ants move to another part of your garden. So again, what I do here is figure out, if you can, what kind of ant you have. You had mentioned red ants, and try to figure out what their predators are. They have predators just like anything else, and then plant the plants that attract those predators. That's the way, if you do that throughout your garden, that's the way to really decrease the number of ants in your garden, and again, that goes for any type of insect. Flavor. This is a great question. Someone had mentioned flavor. In this case, it was winter squash that looked big and beautiful but didn't taste very good. And so often with things being not flavorful, sometimes it's an overwatering issue. Same with tomatoes. If you water too much, if you water every day, they can get watery, and they just never have to struggle to build those flavorful compounds. But it's not always that. I will say this about flavor. Plants sort of have a hierarchy of compounds they build within themselves in order to be as healthy as they can in order to continue their species. And flavor is actually sort of, this is a simplification, but it's kind of like the last thing they worry about. And what I mean by that is, it's not the last thing they worry about, but it is, they need to have incredibly healthy nutrition in order to build flavor. They can live in sort of mediocre soil in order to build some of the lower level compounds they need to build in order to reproduce and protect themselves. But the flavor comes from having excellent soil and excellent nutrition. So that means using really good compost, not a lot, just a little bit of really good compost. It means, someone else had mentioned, Max I think had mentioned bringing in rock dust, which is a great idea. If you can find a glacial or a volcanic rock powder, rock flour, and spread that throughout your garden, that's going to bring in broad spectrum nutrition. Obviously, I always talk about balancing the chemistry in your soil in terms of specific minerals. Usually you want to do that only with a soil test. So that's things like calcium, magnesium, those are important. And then broad spectrum nutrition through rock dust, but as I often talk about, like ocean water is a wonderful thing to bring into your garden. If you live near the ocean, you can just go and get it, or you can buy a product of really concentrated ocean water that I actually sell. Or seaweed is another one. These things bring in so many different nutrients that are going to help your plants produce the flavor that you want out of them. So again, it all comes back to soil nutrition. The other side of nutrition is biology. So that's bringing in microorganisms in terms of compost, but also compost tea and other microbial inoculants, because it's the microorganisms that help plants get nutrients. It's like this partnership that happens in the soil and on plant leaves between microorganisms and plants. And the microorganisms help with everything, including nutrition. A few people mentioned dealing with either sand or clay, and they talked about bringing in topsoil or bringing in peat moss. Those are things that usually are not that beneficial. Actually, what you want to bring in is compost or well-aged manure. It just brings in so much more benefit than topsoil would or peat moss would, often which cause some problems. So bring in the good stuff. And if you have to make your own compost, well, that's even better. Rake up all the leaves every fall from your neighbors. Make your own compost, and just use some of the leaves right in the garden and right on the lawn. Someone had mentioned yellow lettuce and spinach, and they had mentioned they had bought my products for that. That's a good example of these little annuals that can be yellow. Spraying them with seaweed ocean water, effective microorganisms can really help them green up and just be healthy and tasty. Lots of good questions here. Oh yeah, someone had mentioned a white powder on squash, some kind of a mildew. So when it comes to diseases, here are a few things that I will mention. So plant spacing is important. Diseases often occur when your plants are too moist. So if you can plant things a little bit further apart, allow enough airflow, and try not to water the leaves too much, especially at night, because then they just stay wet all throughout the night. That can really help with mildew. And other diseases. Having enough sunlight is important. Put them in full sun mostly. Too much nitrogen causes mildew and other diseases, so don't be putting on a whole lot of fast, like chemical nitrogen or really fast releasing nitrogen. You want to do something slower, like compost or fish. I used to use a lot of fish. Then I started caring about fish health and ocean health, so I don't use it as much anymore. But there is I actually sell a really good fish fertilizer that they use with sort of the byproduct of fish that they would otherwise just be going to the landfill. So at least it's making use of this stuff. Really good for nitrogen. And also just having nutritious plants overall is the answer when it comes to not getting these diseases in the first place. Same with insects and same with flavor. Compost tea can really help with mildews and diseases, as can effective microorganisms. And I'll put it in the comments down below some things you can do with baking soda and garlic and milk and vinegar. They can all be helpful as a spray. Stephanie said, I've been using your advice for several years now, and I'm happy to report that I have very few problems. Thank you. That's good, Stephanie. That's great. My crops are healthier, tastier, and prettier since following your fertilization recommendations, especially the rock dust and foliar feeding. Good. I gave away my tiller, and I plant in compost spread over the top of my beds. That's cool. So I often recommend that when you're just starting a garden, it can be really helpful to till in compost and rock dust and fertilizers, or dig with a fork in that first year. But in the long run, it's often a nicer thing to not be disturbing the soil and the fungi and the earthworms all the time. So eventually, it's nice to go to more of a no-till thing. It sounds like that's what Stephanie did there. And someone had mentioned having heavy clay soil, and they'd put a lot in terms of leaves and compost, and it still wasn't working. I would say the other side of the equation there, so you focused really well on organic matter and biology. The other side might be the chemistry, which is getting a soil test done with like an organically minded lab, and they will help you tweak your nutrition in terms of chemistry. So for example, if you don't have enough calcium but you have too much magnesium and potassium, clay is going to stay compacted and clumpy. And so if you get those things sorted out, it can really help. Now clay is often going to be hard to work with anyway, but this can really help deal with that. Nice thing about clay is that it holds on to nutrition well, so you can grow really nutrient-dense crops. So that's just me talking a lot. I hope some of you have made it throughout this video. This is just the time of year when I can't really dig in my garden yet, so I kind of have to talk into the camera.